The air in the high pine forest was thin and cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of sun-warmed pine resin and dry, dusty earth. It was late afternoon in early October, and the aspen groves I'd passed lower down were already flashes of brilliant, impossible gold against the deep green of the fir and spruce. Here, above 10,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies, the sunlight was a liquid gold, pouring through the gaps in the canopy, illuminating dust motes dancing in silent, frantic galaxies. My boots made a soft, steady crunch on the gravelly trail, a sound that had become the rhythm of my day, of my life for the past 72 hours on this solo backpacking trip. The world was reduced to this. The weight of my pack, the ache in my shoulders, the map in my pocket, and the next step forward. I was aiming for a specific campsite I knew, a small, flat clearing beside a creek called Snowmelt Fork, still a mile or so ahead. The guidebook promised reliable water and a bear box. The thought of the bear box was a comfort, a small anchor of civilization in all this vast, untamed space. I'd been diligent about safety, hanging my food scrupulously every night, making noise on blind corners of the trail, storing anything with a scent. Toothpaste, sunscreen, with the food. It was a respectful ritual, an acknowledgement that I was a guest here, and the true residents operated on a different set of rules. The trail began to descend into a narrower valley, the tall pines giving way to thicker stands of lodgepole, their trunks slender and uniform, like a crowd of silent spectators. The sound of the creek reached me first, a distant, constant whisper that grew into a gentle rush. The air grew damp and cool, smelling of wet stone and decaying leaves. It was in this shaded, quiet stretch that I first saw him. A man was sitting on a large, moss-covered boulder just off the trail, about 100 yards ahead. He was unusually still. Most hikers you meet on the trail have a certain look about them, a weariness, a purpose, a layer of dust. This man looked clean. He wore brand new, expensive-looking hiking clothes, but they lacked the grime and creases of real use. His boots looked as if they'd just come out of the box. He wasn't looking at the scenery or consulting a map. He was just sitting upright, his hands resting on his knees, staring intently at a young pine sapling a few feet in front of him. A slight prickle, the faintest whisper of an instinct, went down my spine. Something was off. As I got closer, I could hear him speaking, his voice a low, resonant monotone that cut through the sound of the creek. "You are strong," he was saying to the sapling. "You are resilient. You push through the rock. You reach for the sun. Your roots are deep. Your purpose is clear." I slowed my pace. He wasn't just talking, he was preaching. It was a performance without an audience, or perhaps I had become the audience. I gave a wide berth, my boots scuffing deliberately on the gravel to announce my presence without startling him. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes locked onto mine. They were an intense, piercing blue, and they held a strange, unnerving certainty. "Ah," he said, his voice gaining a practiced, welcoming warmth. "A traveler, feeling the power of this place. It's palpable, isn't it? The raw, untamed energy." I offered a noncommittal nod and a faint smile, the universal hiker's greeting that also means I'm just passing through. "It's a beautiful spot." "Beautiful is a shallow word," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "It's transformative. I'm Julian Croft." He said the name as if I should recognize it. I didn't. I introduced myself simply, keeping my tone neutral. I shifted the weight of my pack, a clear signal I intended to keep moving. "You know," he said, his gaze drifting back to the sapling, "most people live their lives surrounded by limitations. They see a rock in their path and they think, obstacle. They never realize that the rock and the path and their own perception are all just thoughts. Change the thought and you change the reality." "Is that so?" I murmured, my eyes scanning the trail ahead, calculating the distance to my campsite. "It is the only truth," he stated, his voice flat and absolute. "I teach this. I've written books on it. The reality you command. Your world is a mirror of your mind. If you see lack, you create lack. If you see sickness, you manifest sickness. The key is to hold the perfect image, the pure, positive thought, and the universe has no choice but to conform." It was classic, garden variety hubris, polished up with a wilderness backdrop. I'd heard variations of it before from friends who dabbled in expensive seminars. But out here, with the deep, ancient silence of the mountains all around, it felt more than just foolish. It felt like a violation of some unspoken law. The forest didn't care about his positive thoughts. It cared about water, sunlight, predation, and decay. I was about to make my excuses when a squirrel, plump and busy with its autumn preparations, chattered noisily from a branch above Julian's head. It scolded us, its tail jerking in sharp, irritated flicks. Julian's head snapped up. A look of profound annoyance crossed his face. "Noise," he muttered. "Chaos, the chattering of a fearful mind." He closed his eyes for a moment, his brow furrowing in concentration. He wasn't just ignoring it, he was actively, visibly resisting it. "Be still," he whispered, not to the squirrel, but to himself, to the universe. "Be silent. There is only peace. There is only quiet." The squirrel, of course, continued its tirade. Julian's jaw tightened. The focused intensity I'd seen earlier on the sapling turned into something harder, sharper. He opened his eyes and stared directly at the squirrel with a terrifying, laser-like focus. It was no longer a look of annoyance. It was a look of pure, unadulterated will. Command. "You are not here," he said, his voice low and gritty. "You are a disruption. And disruptions cease." A coldness that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled in my stomach. This was more than just self-help nonsense. This was the core of it, the unhinged belief that his consciousness could bend the world to his whim. I felt a strong urge to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this man as possible. And then it happened. The squirrel gave one last, furious chatter, turned to leap to a higher branch, and missed. It wasn't a clumsy slip. It was a sudden, shocking convulsion. Its body went rigid in midair, and it dropped like a stone. It hit the soft bed of pine needles below with a soft, dull thud. It did not move. It did not twitch. It was simply, utterly dead. The silence that followed was deafening. The creek's rush seemed to fade into a distant hum. My own breath caught in my throat. I stared at the small, inert body, my mind racing through possibilities. A disease, a pre-existing condition, a coincidence so wild it felt like a physical blow. Julian let out a slow, satisfied breath. He looked at the dead squirrel, then at me, a faint, serene smile playing on his lips. "You see," he said softly. "Peace." My instincts were screaming at me now. Every fiber of my being told me to run. This was not a coincidence. The timing was too perfect, the correlation too direct. The man's words, his focused will, and the immediate, silent death of the creature. I felt a primitive fear, the kind that bypasses logic and settles deep in the marrow of your bones. I was not afraid of Julian Croft the man. I was afraid of what he might be, of what he might unknowingly or knowingly unleash. "I have to go," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "I need to make camp before dark." "Of course," Julian said, his tone magnanimous, as if he'd just demonstrated a fascinating parlor trick. "The mind needs solitude to integrate new truths. Perhaps our paths will cross again. This trail has a way of bringing together those who are ready for the next level." That was the last thing I wanted. I gave a curt nod and walked on, forcing myself not to look back, not to break into a run. I could feel his gaze on my back until the trail curved and the trees hid him from view. The moment I was out of sight, my pace quickened. The comforting rhythm of my hike was gone, replaced by a frantic, urgent need for distance. I reached the Snowmelt Fork campsite just as the sun dipped below the rim of the valley, plunging the creek bed into deep, blue shadow. The clearing was there, flat and soft with pine duff, and the sturdy, metal bear box was a welcome sight. My hands trembled slightly as I unbuckled my pack. The image of the squirrel falling was burned into my mind. I tried to rationalize it. Aneurysm, poison, anything. But the look in Julian's eyes, that absolute terrifying certainty, would not let me believe it. I set up my tent with practiced, mechanical efficiency, my ears straining for any sound beyond the creek. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made my heart jump. I was not just listening for bears or moose anymore. I was listening for a man in clean boots. Once the tent was up and my sleeping gear laid out, I took my water filter and cooking pot to the creek. The water was ice cold, numbing my fingers as I filled the pot. I was kneeling there, the steady gurgle of the water a soothing balm, when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of a footstep on the other side of the creek. I froze, my head snapping up. It was him, Julian. He stood on the opposite bank, maybe 30 feet away, watching me. In the fading light, his face was half in shadow, his expression unreadable. "A fine spot for contemplation," he said, his voice carrying easily over the water's noise. The element of flow, very conducive to clearing mental blockages. I didn't answer. I slowly, carefully, stood up, keeping the water pot in my hand. It was a poor weapon, but it was something. He gestured to a large, dead pine tree that leaned precariously over the creek on his side. "Look at that," he said. "A life ended. Stands there, a monument to decay. A negative focal point. It blocks the light, clutters the space." A fresh wave of cold dread washed over me. "It's just a tree," I said, my voice low. "It's part of the forest. Provides a home for insects, for woodpeckers. It will fall one day and nourish the soil." He waved a dismissive hand. "The small-minded view of biology. I see the deeper truth. It is an eyesore, a manifestation of stagnant energy. It does not belong in this perfect scene." He focused on the dead pine, his body going still, his gaze intensifying. I knew that look now. It was the same look he'd given the squirrel. This was different, though. This was bigger. The air around us grew heavy, the way it does before a storm. The cheerful rush of the creek seemed to grow muted. A subtle pressure built in my ears. "You are weak," Julian whispered. But his whisper seemed to cut through everything. "Your roots are rotten. Your time is over. You will fall." Nothing happened for a long moment. The dead tree stood, a gray skeleton against the darkening green of the living forest. Julian's face began to redden with the strain. A vein throbbed on his temple. He was pushing, his entire being focused into that one command. Then I heard it, a low, deep groan, the sound of wood fibers stressed beyond their limit. It was a sound of profound, ancient protest. "No," I breathed. With a sound like a cannon shot, the trunk of the dead pine splintered. It didn't just fall. It seemed to explode from its own base, shattering outward. The massive tree tore through the canopy, its dead branches snapping like gunfire, and crashed directly across the creek, its trunk landing with a ground-shaking impact not 10 feet from where Julian stood. The spray of water and debris soaked me. I stood, paralyzed, the water pot forgotten in my hand. The creek was now blocked, the scene utterly transformed by the colossal, shattered corpse of the tree. Julian stood on the other side, untouched. He was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead, but he was smiling, a wide, triumphant, ecstatic smile. "You see," he panted, his eyes wild with power. "There is no limit. The mind is the only reality." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the gloom of the forest on his side of the creek, leaving me alone with the wreckage. I didn't move for a long time. The shock was a physical thing, a cold weight in my chest. The squirrel could have been a coincidence. This was not. This was an undeniable, catastrophic event willed into being by a man's deranged focus. He wasn't just imagining things, he was weaponizing his consciousness. My safe, predictable world of trails and topo maps and bare safety had just been ripped open, revealing something dark and incomprehensible beneath. I was alone in the wilderness with a man who could kill with a thought. The night that followed was the longest of my life. I sat in the mouth of my tent, my back to the wall of the forest, my head on a swivel. I didn't cook dinner. I ate a handful of trail mix and drank filtered water, my stomach in a tight knot. Every sound was a potential threat. The hoot of an owl made me jump. The scuttling of a pack rat near the bear box sent my heart into my throat. The wind, sighing through the pines, sounded like a whispered conversation. My mind raced through my options. I could pack up and try to hike out in the dark. That was a terrible idea. The trail was rocky and steep, and a broken ankle would make me a stationary target. I could stay and hope he moved on. But what if he didn't? What if he decided I, too, was a negative focal point? I thought about the landmarks I'd passed. I was about 8 miles from the trailhead. I knew there was a ranger station about 5 miles down the trail, but it was seasonal and likely closed now. My safety strategies were all for dealing with animals, not for dealing with this. How do you hide from a thought? The only strategy one could devise was silence and stillness. I became a part of the forest, breathing shallowly, listening with every pore of my body. The half-moon rose, casting a weak, silvery light that created more shadows than it dispelled. The dead pine lay across the creek like a monstrous bridge, a constant, grim reminder of the power I was up against. It was in the deepest part of the night, in that hour when the world feels utterly abandoned, that I heard his voice again. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the clear, cold air with an unnatural clarity. He was nearby, very nearby. "I can feel your resistance," he called out. He wasn't shouting. He was speaking calmly, conversationally, as if we were sitting across a campfire. "Your fear is a cloud, pollutes the purity of this place. You are clinging to the old reality, the reality of limits, of death." I held my breath, my hand closing around the solid metal handle of my hiking pole. It was a pitiful defense. "You witnessed the truth today," he continued. His voice seemed to be moving, circling the periphery of my campsite. I couldn't pinpoint its direction. "You saw the power of a focused mind, free from doubt. But you refused to accept it. Your refusal is a blockage." I knew then, with a chilling certainty, what was going to happen. I was the next disruption. I was the next thing that didn't belong in his perfect world. I had to move. Staying in the tent was suicide. It was a bright nylon coffin. As silently as I could, I unzipped the inner mesh and crawled out into the cold. I kept low, using the shadows of the trees for cover, and moved away from the sound of his voice, toward the jumbled chaos of the fallen tree. "You can't hide from a new paradigm," Julian sang out, his voice taking on a teasing, almost playful tone. It was more terrifying than any shout. "Your physical form is just a thought, a fragile, fleeting thought." I reached the massive, shattered trunk of the pine and pressed myself against its rough, splintered bark. The scent of fresh sap and broken wood was overwhelming. I peered through a tangle of branches, trying to see him, and then I did. He was standing at the edge of my campsite, looking at my empty tent. The moonlight lit his profile. He looked serene, beatific, like a prophet in expensive Gore-Tex. "It's a pity," he said, turning slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. They passed over my hiding place without stopping. "You had potential, but your mind is too closed, too fearful." He closed his eyes. He took a deep, centering breath, just as he had with the squirrel and the tree. He was going to do it. He was going to will me out of existence. My own mind screamed in protest. This couldn't be how it ended. Not here, not like this. I thought of my life, of the people I loved, of the simple, physical reality of my own heartbeat. It was real. It was mine. It was not his to command. And in that moment of sheer, desperate defiance, a thought, clear and sharp, cut through the terror. His reality is a house of cards. It only stands if you believe in it. He was manifesting his will, but his will was dependent on a target, on something external to resist, to dominate. What if there was no resistance? What if I simply wasn't there for him to focus on? It was a crazy, impossible idea, but it was all I had. I stopped fighting him. I stopped fearing him. I let my mind go quiet, not in surrender, but in a kind of active erasure. I focused on the feeling of the rough bark against my cheek. I focused on the sound of the water trickling beneath the fallen log. I became the bark. I became the sound of the water. I made myself not a person hiding, but a part of the forest, neutral, meaningless, devoid of the mental energy he needed to push against. I was not a blockage. I was just a thing, a rock, a stream, a dead tree. I emptied my mind of everything, especially of him. I saw his brow furrow. The serene smile faltered. He was pushing, but he was pushing against nothing. His will, which required a target to obliterate, found only emptiness. No, he muttered, a note of confusion in his voice. Be afraid. Be here. Be a problem that needs to be solved. He strained harder, his hands clenching into fists. The air grew thick again, but this time it was a confused, frustrated pressure, like a storm that couldn't find its center. And then he turned his gaze inward. In his frantic search for a negative thought to conquer, for a disruption to silence, he found the only thing left, himself. His own doubt, his own frustration, the sheer, impossible effort of bending a universe that was suddenly, profoundly indifferent to him. His eyes widened in sudden, horrified understanding. He was the disruption. He was the chaotic thought in the quiet mind of the forest. No, he whispered, this time to himself. I am peace. I am power. I am control. But the spell was broken. The feedback loop of his own will, with no external outlet, turned in on itself. He staggered back a step, clutching his chest. His face was a mask of terror and disbelief. He was no longer the master of his reality. He was a man in the cold, dark woods, realizing he had just thrown a rock at a mirror. He made a small, choked sound. Then he collapsed. He fell to the pine needles, his body curling into a fetal position. He did not move again. I stayed pressed against the log for what felt like an eternity, watching. The moon continued its slow journey across the sky. The creek continued to flow. The forest was once again just a forest. When the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale gray, I finally emerged. My body was stiff with cold and tension. I walked over to where Julian lay. He was dead. There was no mark on him, no sign of a struggle. His eyes were open, staring at the canopy with a look of utter, final surprise. I packed my gear with numb, automatic movements. I did not look at him again. I hiked the 8 miles to the trailhead in a daze, my mind a blank slate. I drove to the nearest town and found a sheriff's deputy. I told him I'd found a dead hiker, gave him the location, and described the fallen tree as a landmark. I said I had no idea what happened. It was, in a way, the complete truth. They asked me questions, of course, and I answered them simply. A man named Julian Croft. He seemed intense. I left it at that. There was an autopsy. Found no clear cause of death. It was ruled a likely sudden cardiac event, brought on by the high altitude and physical exertion. A tragedy, but not a mystery. The world, with its love for simple physical explanations, filed it away. But I knew. I had learned the final, terrible lesson of his philosophy. The mind is a powerful thing. It can build empires of hope, or it can build prisons of fear. But when it tries to command reality itself, when it mistakes its own desires for the laws of the universe, it creates a feedback loop of pure, self-consuming will. Julian Croft didn't manifest his own death by imagining it. He manifested it by believing, with every fiber of his being, that he was above the system of which he was an inseparable part. He tried to narrate the forest, and in the end, the forest, vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent, simply absorbed his story back into its silence. The only thing his positive thinking ever truly commanded was the void that eventually swallowed him. And the only thing that saved me was the humble, physical truth of a tree, a stream, and my own small, quiet place within it all. The heat was the first thing you noticed, a thick, heavy blanket that settled on your shoulders the moment you stepped out of the air-conditioned car. It was late August in central Nebraska, and the air itself felt like soup, thick with the smell of hot earth and growing things. The sun, a white-hot coin in a pale, bleached sky, beat down on the gravel road, making the air above it shimmer. I was there because of my uncle, my mother's brother, who owned one of the thousands of farms that checkerboard this part of the state. He'd asked for help before the harvest, and I, between jobs and city life, had said yes. It was a chance for quiet, I thought, for simplicity, The farmhouse was a two-story white clapboard, faded and peeling, standing sentinel against an ocean of green. And that green was the corn. It stretched in every direction, a vast, rustling army of stalks twice the height of a man. From the porch, you could see nothing else. No other houses, no hills, just the endless, segmented rows and the dome of the sky. The only sounds were the buzz of insects, a constant, drowsy hum, and the dry whisper of countless leaves rubbing against each other. It was a lonely kind of beautiful, a landscape that made you feel very small. My Uncle Frank was a quiet man. His face a roadmap of wrinkles earned from a lifetime of squinting into the same sun. He showed me the old silver water pump out back, the root cellar with its cool, damp darkness, and the way to the small grove of oak trees that marked the northern property line. "If you ever get turned around out there," he said, his voice a low gravel, "head for the oaks. You can see 'em from just about anywhere. The corn. It all looks the same." He didn't say it with fear, just a simple statement of fact. The corn was a maze, and it was easy to get lost. That first evening, after a dinner of silent chewing, he took a long swallow of iced tea and looked out the screen door. "You'll hear things," he said. "The locals. About the field." I waited, wiping the condensation from my glass. "They say the corn keeps a record," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the green wall across the road. "Of the lost ones, the children. Every now and then, you wake up, and the wind has carved a name into the stalks. A new one, for a child that's gone missing somewhere in the country." I felt a small, cold trickle down my spine, despite the heat. "Carved? How?" He just shook his head. "Not with a knife. Smoother. Like the stalks grew that way. The letters are clear as day." He finally looked at me. "It's an old story. Don't pay it no mind. Just a story." But the way he said it, the careful, deliberate tone, told me he did pay it mind. He respected it. I went to bed that night in the small, hot upstairs room, the whisper of the corn coming through the open window. It sounded different now. Less like leaves, more like voices, a low, sibilant conversation just below the threshold of hearing. I woke to a change. The air was cooler, moving with a purpose. A wind had kicked up in the night, a steady, persistent breeze that made the cornfield roar. It was a deep, rushing sound, like a distant river. After a quick breakfast, Uncle Frank handed me a heavy, long-sleeved shirt. "Corn leaves'll cut you up," he said. "And take this." It was an old wooden-handled hatchet, its blade nicked and stained. "For marking your path if you have to. Just a notch at the base of a stalk every 20 paces or so. Better than breadcrumbs." My task for the day was simple. Walk the perimeter, check the irrigation lines on the South 40. It sounded straightforward on the porch. Stepping into the corn was like entering another world. The moment I passed the first row, the farmhouse vanished. The sky became a narrow strip of blue, fragmented by the waving tassels far above. The light turned green and murky, filtered through millions of leaves. The temperature dropped a good 10 degrees in the shade of the stalks. The smell was overpowering, a sweet, dusty, vegetative scent that filled my nose and lungs. The sound of the wind was no longer a distant roar. It was everything. It was a physical presence, pushing through the narrow corridors, making the stalks sway and creak. The rustling was a constant, layered noise, a symphony of dry friction. I could feel the wind on my skin, a cool touch in the green gloom, and I could hear it, a low whistle as it forced its way through the tight spaces. I walked for what felt like an hour, following the vague edge of the field where it met a rusting wire fence. The rows were perfectly straight, but it was disorienting. Every direction looked identical. I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than I needed to, the primitive part of my brain insisting I was being watched. I remembered Uncle Frank's words about the oaks, and I tried to keep a mental picture of where they should be, but in this green labyrinth, all sense of direction was a fragile thing. I paused to take a drink from my canteen, leaning against a thick stalk. The silence beneath the wind felt heavy, expectant. That's when I saw the first one. It wasn't a full name. It was just a few letters, carved into the broad, green leaf of a stalk at eye level. J.O.S. The letters were perfect, as if they'd been carefully incised by a skilled calligrapher. The edges weren't rough or torn. They were smooth, almost polished, as if the plant itself had grown around the emptiness of the shapes. It felt ancient like runes. I reached out and traced the smooth groove of the J with my fingertip. It was cool and waxy. A deep chill, unrelated to the temperature, settled in my bones. This was real. My heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't a story anymore. It was a fact of this place, as real as the soil under my boots. I looked around, suddenly feeling like an intruder. The wind seemed to pull at my clothes, a little more insistently. I decided to turn back. The irrigation lines could wait, but which way was back? In my fascination with the carved letters, I had lost my bearing. The fence line had curved, or I had strayed from it. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my mind. I forced it down. Breathe. Think. Uncle Frank's advice echoed in my head. The oaks. I couldn't see them. The hatchet. I took it from my belt and, feeling a pang of guilt, cut a small, clean notch at the base of a sturdy stalk. The sound of the blade biting into the fibrous flesh was shockingly loud. I began to walk, marking a stalk every 20 paces. The wind continued its relentless work, and now I started to see more names. They weren't on every stalk, but they appeared every 50 yards or so, emerging from the green like ghosts. Lily, Benjamin, Maria. Each one was a fresh wound, a perfect, impossible engraving. I thought of the parents of these children hundreds of miles away, their lives shattered. And here, in this silent, lonely field, their names were being whispered by the wind, recorded in a language of plant and air. I walked for another half-hour, my notches my only connection to a world I understood. The green corridors seemed to stretch on forever. Then I saw something different ahead. A break in the monotony. It was a small clearing, a place where a dozen or so stalks had been knocked down, their yellow-white innards exposed. In the center of the clearing was a weathered, gray stone, no bigger than a loaf of bread. It was a landmark, but not one Uncle Frank had mentioned. It felt older, a forgotten piece of the land. As I approached, I saw that the entire clearing was surrounded by names. They were carved deeper here on multiple stalks, facing inward like an audience. And in the center, on the face of the gray stone, was a single stark word, carved with the same impossible smoothness. Remember. I stood there for a long time, the wind whipping around the small space. This wasn't just a record. It was a memorial, a shrine built by something I could not comprehend. The fear I felt was still there, but it was changing, morphing into something else. A profound, aching sadness. This place wasn't malicious. It was a keeper of grief. The wind was its pen, the corn its parchment. It was then that I heard a different sound, a soft crunching. I froze, my hand tightening on the hatchet. From between two rows of corn, a dog emerged. It was a lanky, mixed-breed hound, its coat dusty and burr-filled. It looked at me with calm, tired eyes, its tail giving a half-hearted wag. It wasn't a threat. It was just a farm dog, probably from a neighboring property. It sniffed the air, glanced at the stone, and then trotted off down a row and was gone, its passage marked only by the swaying of the stalks. The encounter was so normal, so mundane, that it broke the spell of dread. It grounded me. I looked at the stone, at the word remember, and I knew what I had to do. I had to stop trying to escape. I had to acknowledge this place. I walked to the center of the clearing, faced the stone, and simply said, out loud, I see them. The wind, which had been blowing steadily, suddenly stilled. The rustling ceased, and for the first time since I'd entered the field, there was a deep, profound silence. It was more unnerving than the noise had been. The air felt charged, waiting. Then, a gentle breeze started up again, but this time it was different. It was softer, a caress rather than a push. It moved through the clearing and rustled the leaves with a sound that was almost like a sigh. I looked at my last notch, took a bearing and started walking. I didn't need to mark my path anymore. I knew the way. 20 minutes later, I broke out of the green wall and into the blinding sunlight of the gravel road. The farmhouse was just up ahead. The roar of the corn was once again a distant whisper. Uncle Frank was on the porch, shelling peas. He looked up as I approached, his eyes searching my face. He saw the dust, the sweat, and the look in my eyes that I couldn't hide. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, sinking into the other rocking chair. "I saw the names, and a clearing, with a stone." He was silent for a long time, his fingers working nimbly on the pea pods. "The Anderson boy," he said finally, his voice soft, "went missing from a campground in Iowa back in '78. They found his name out there the next morning. Little Timmy Anderson. The stone. That was there before my granddaddy bought this land." He looked out at the field. "It doesn't happen for everyone, just some. The ones the wind finds, I guess." I didn't tell him about the wind stopping. I didn't tell him about the feeling of being heard. Some things are too fragile for words. I stayed for 2 more weeks until the harvest began. I never went deep into the corn again unless I had to, and never alone. But every morning, I would walk to the edge of the field and look down the first row. And every morning, the field was just a field. I left before the big machines came to chop down the silent, green army. As I drove away, the vastness of the corn receding in my rearview mirror, I didn't feel a sense of relief. I felt a weight. I had gone to the farm looking for simplicity, and I had found something infinitely more complex. The world was not just a physical place of sun and soil. It had memory. It had a voice, expressed in the language of rustling leaves and carving winds. I learned that some landscapes hold more than just geography. They hold stories. They hold sorrow. The great, flat plains of America are not empty. They are full of silence. And in that silence, things are remembered. The cornfield doesn't solve the mysteries or bring the children back. It doesn't offer comfort or explanation. It simply bears witness. It keeps their names, and in doing so, it reminds us that loss is a force of nature, as real and as relentless as the wind.